Are you a food or drink junkie? If you keep meaning to change your food or drink habits but fail, you might be stuck in an addiction trap. My guest in this podcast is clinical psychologist Dr. Jen Unwin, an expert in food addiction who is campaigning to get it recognized in the same way that alcohol addiction is. The ever increasing prevalence of addiction to junk food, sugar, and carbs, as well as alcohol and coffee, keeps many people trapped in a cycle of fatigue, weight gain, poor sleep, and ultimately metabolic diseases from diabetes to dementia. Now, if you'd like to break free from all food and drink cravings and understand how addiction is a major drag factor in your health transformation, you are in the right place. Dr. Jen Unwin, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Thank you for having me.
I've always thought behind every great man is a great woman. Uh, so it's good to have you on the podcast because before we've spoken to your husband, Dr. David Unwin, who has very skillfully managed to bring in the whole conversation of metabolism and eating lower glycemic load, less carbs, less sugar, and so on. But of course, it's one thing to know what to do, it's another thing to do it. So I always had that strong feeling that behind all these wonderful patients whose diabetes he has transformed was somebody who was helping them to learn how to eat different things. And I imagine that that was you.
Yeah, I mean, it has been a real joint project in that sense. Yeah, we decided to be about 13 or 14 years ago now to David was kind of going to retire as a GP. He was a bit fed up, people on more and more drugs, getting sicker and sicker. So we kind of said, well, why don't we have one last sort of fling, so to speak, before you retire, and try and combine our skills because we'd never worked together before, and my thing was all about, obviously, as a clinical psychologist working in health settings, was all about quality of life, behavior change, motivation for lifestyle changes, all of that stuff. So yeah, so we set to on all the patients with type 2 diabetes in his practice, um, getting him to consult in a slightly different way, more about lifestyle change than about sort of finding out problems and prescribing drugs. And as time's gone on, like you, we've sort of come to realize that although the advice is incredibly simple, and we laugh sometimes about being flown all over the world to basically tell people don't eat sugar and refined carbohydrate. Um, the advice is incredibly simple, but the following of that advice is not always easy. So it's not just giving people information. If we just told people not to smoke because it's bad for their health, then nobody would smoke, would they? And of course that doesn't work for many people. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It's about psychology and, you know, sort of neurology, if you like, and the way that the primitive brain gets involved in driving some behaviors. So we've thought more and more about that. And of course, my own story, which I've talked about many times on other podcasts, is for sure one of a sugar addict, a food addict. And it, even as a psychologist, it took me many decades to work that out. So I know how strong denial can be, for people who don't want to see the problem for what it really is, because no addict really wants to give up their drug.
Well, yeah, and let's talk about that because we're sort of aware of drug addiction and we're aware of alcohol addiction, and we'll talk about the slippery slope of sort of dependence to addiction. But, of course, what people are struggling with so often is they want sweet foods. But does food addiction really exist? What's the kind of extreme of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, people say, well, you can't be addicted to food because you have to eat. And that's a very good point. Yeah. And nobody's addicted to sort of food in general as a substance, let's say. What people tend to get addicted to is sugar, refined carbohydrates, and ultra processed foods. Not surprisingly, because they're really formulated so that we eat more and more of them because it's a sort of, commercial model. They want you to eat more and more of them, and they even, put people in brain scanners while they and give them various formulations of their foods to see which of those formulations light our brains up the most in the reward center. So, um, although people can overeat real foods like nuts and cheese, those aren't the sort of main culprits, if you like. Those aren't the thing. That's not where it starts. That may become a problem later on. Or, of course, we do know that some people with eating disorders will binge eat on just about anything, but usually that's to do with a prior restriction of food in general. So that again, it's those sort of ancestral mechanisms overtaking their eating behaviors and kind of driving them to eat very powerfully because to survive basically. Yeah, so we're trying to sort of get people to refer to it as ultra processed food use disorder or ultra processed food addiction to sort of point the finger where the finger should be pointed, and that these behaviors are survival behaviors. We're sort of driven in a primitive way to eat those foods that have any sweetness or any kind of hyperpalatability because that's how we got through the winter back in the day. We were sort of wired to be able to overeat. There was that sort of the brakes were off if we found those kinds of foods because we needed to fatten up for the winter. And now, of course, the winter never comes, as they say, and we're living in perpetual food autumn with all the fruit all the time, sugars all the time. Yeah, pizza all the time. Literally at the sort of press of a button on your phone, a chap's going to come round and deliver you a hyper palatable pizza, which sort of overstimulates various neurotransmitters in the brain and then gets us into a cycle of overconsumption and craving,
Now,
which is
yeah, I've had
um,
clients who had to wake up in the night to eat. And I remember
yes,
one who had a mini fridge next to his bed, so he got through about 3 cans of Coke,
yeah,
during the night.
yes,
Absolutely hooked.
yes. I mean, some incredible. And I think it's one of those conditions where, because partly because it isn't acknowledged, and people are sort of bit of ashamed of that sort of their behavior. They don't talk about it other than to, professionals like us sort of behind closed doors. So, people often haven't heard these sort of you know, patient experiences where, yeah, it's quite common to feel terrible in the night and to even sort of wake up with those cravings and have to eat the sugars. Yeah.
And of course, some people say, well, I'm not that extreme because denial is really important. And I'm not talking about a place in Egypt.
Yes.
So, what are the six telltale signs that your love of sugar is actually moving you more into a dependent, addictive state?
Yes, let's get into the weeds. So what we all think in the space is that addiction is addiction is addiction, and all the sort of signs and symptoms, if you like, are exactly the same as we would apply to someone with an alcohol problem, drug misuse problem, nicotine. It's all the same sort of symptoms that people get. So let's run through what the WHO consider to be the six symptoms of addiction in general, because let's remember that food addiction isn't yet one of those recognized disorders yet, because it will be soon, hopefully. So, an easy way to remember that we've come up with is to remember the word craved. And so we'll go through them. So C is for cravings and compulsions, which is, kind of the hallmark really, is that you get strong cravings and compulsions to eat, in this case, certain foods that are too difficult to resist. So like your chap, presumably doesn't want to be waking up in the night to drink Coca-Cola because that's disrupting his sleep and he probably knows it's harming his health. But he'll wake up in the night and the cravings are so strong that he actually has to, to do it, to be able to even settle to get back to sleep. Um, so that's number one, cravings and compulsions. Number two, we've called reaching for more, but really it's getting at the idea of tolerance, which again, we all recognize from other addictions. So we all recognize that if you have a glass of wine every night, um, you get to the point where a glass of wine doesn't really touch the sides in a sense. It doesn't give you that tipsy feeling or that sort of feeling that you're looking for. And that's where people can start to sort of escalate consumption. So it's the same with ultra processed foods that, maybe it starts out that you've got a bit of a penchant for. I'm going to use the example of Maltesers because Heidi, who I work with very closely, this used to be her thing, and so, but then the amount that you need becomes more and more over time. So she'd have to buy the family bag instead of the individual bag, and she'd also have it's very common for food ultra processed food addicts to have a stash of their, like you say, the chat with his Coke in the bedroom, or I heard of someone whose thing was Terry's chocolate oranges and would go to Costa and get the crate, the trays of them, probably 24 or something, and she stashed all these under her bed. Um, so needing more and more to get the same effect is the second one. A is another common feature of addiction, and it's sort of becoming to neglect activities. So it's A for activities, where the focus of the person's thoughts and behaviors becomes more and more about the substance and less about family, friends, hobbies, work, and all of those sorts of, kind of good things in life. The person's thoughts and behaviors become more focused around getting the food, thinking about the food, trying to recover from having the food, where am I going to get next? When's the next snack or meal? This is a thing that probably people listening will really recognize with. Um, so that's A. So
So
V.
kind of
So
living to eat rather than eating to live.
there we are. You've put it so much more succinctly, but yes, exactly that.
Well, I was
Uh,
amazed at my last birthday. I guess, I've got everything I need, really. I got given like 6 bottles of alcohol,
yeah.
whiskey, rum, this and that. And it's just amazing how our sort of, like if you have a day off or, it's your birthday or something, it seems to all be about having something to eat and having something to drink,
Mm,
particularly something sweet.
mm,
Yes.
absolutely.
CRA activity. What's the V for?
Activities. Yeah, so V is for volume, and this is the idea that anyone who actually has a substance use disorder can't control the amount, can't control the volume. So we all know that. We all recognize that with people with a drink problem, that when they have one, they sort of, they lose any sense of control and they go off on a bender sort of thing. And it's the same with food. So you might say to yourself, right, well, I've bought this packet of biscuits for the grandchildren, and there it is, for when they arrive. And I'll just sit down and have a couple, peacefully before they come. And then, before you know it, you've eaten half the packet or the whole packet. Or, somebody might say, I'll just have one slice of that pizza, but it never is one slice, never is one slice, it never is one biscuit, never has been, never will be for a food addict. So that's volume. E is for exclusion, which is withdrawal symptoms, essentially. Obviously, we understand that in other addictions, there's always withdrawal symptoms. There are for sure withdrawal symptoms for people with sugar and ultra processed food. And if anybody doubts that, then try going sugar and ultra processed free and refined carb free for a few days if you're not already. And people describe, kind of gastrointestinal symptoms, sleep problems, headaches is a common one. That's one that I really had when I gave up. Headaches, shakiness, grumpiness. And this is where the kind of hangry, the idea of people, when they're hangry, quite often that's because it's not just to do with hunger, but it's to do with the fact that the blood sugars are crashing out and the craving a sugary hit.
How
Yeah,
long do those symptoms usually last?
yeah, it varies a lot between people. I would say t t t 8 days to 2 weeks for the sort of real physiological stuff around the sugar and the low blood sugars, because after that your body starts getting the idea and will start sort of doing the whole keto producing ketones, and you start to feel a lot better physically and physiologically. What you can get though is the sort of what we call post-acute withdrawal, where it can even be up to 6 months. People suddenly get real cravings, real kind of sadness for the fact that they're not no longer eating those things. They have a sort of I think they've got past that point where they think, well, I've kind of done it now, I can do it. But there's this, whether it's I don't know if that's something to do with an adaptation in the brain or it's a psychological thing that you get. Yeah, you can get this post-acute um increase in cravings. I've just seen an article about it recently by Claire Wilcox, actually, who's just published a book that we could talk about if there's time. Um, she wrote an article on this idea of post-acute withdrawal and the cravings kind of intensifying and how you can get through that. Obviously, we all need to get through that and stay abstinent. Yeah, so it varies for people, and there's an acute phase and a sort of post-acute phase.
And what's the last? D, or is
So
it?
D, yes, D for this is the one that I think really defines any addiction, and sort of looking back is the thing that should have really given me some clues. And that's continued use despite knowing it's doing you damage. So there's two D's there, despite knowing it's doing you damage. That, say, somebody with type 2 diabetes or obesity, or even people perhaps with cognitive problems, who know that they feel worse over time for eating these foods, and they know those foods are doing them harm. They've maybe read in the they've read Chris Van Tulken's book, or they've seen something in the paper about the harms of ultra processed food, and they want to stop, but they're unable to stay stopped or have a sustained sort of abstinence. So um even though they want to. So that's a real defining feature of addiction for me.
Now, before we get into the hub, which is how do we break through, I'd like to explore both the psychological and the sort of physiological, what's actually happening in the brain.
Mhm.
Why are those UPF manufacturers sticking people in brain scans? But
Yeah.
psychologically, the biggest influence I ever had as a psychologist was through the brilliant work of a man called Oscar Chazo, who hasn't really made it into the mainstream at all. And he had this wonderful model called the doors of compensation. And the essence of it is that our psyche is like a container. And when something happens that doesn't fit, I mean, for example, someone dies or you lose your job or you bust up with your partner or whatever it is, something happens. It
Mhm.
creates this pressure in the container and we have to let off steam. And we sort of know this, drinking a lot, when you're grieving or something, doing something. And there are nine of them. I won't go through them all, but nine doors that you can use. And
Mhm.
one is called toximania. So you use a substance that is toxic in order to dissipate your energy. And of course,
Yeah.
that's where you drink until you're completely drunk. Sugar really, could function in that way also as a toxin. And the other is gluttony, where you whatever it is you do. I mean, it could be watching loads of rom-coms, or it could be, in this case, eating and eating and eating and eating to the point where you are basically numb,
Yeah.
sort of numbing activities. And in the model, the door can be partly open, or it goes into stage three where it's always open. And when you have that alcoholic drink or when you eat that sugar, you can't stop. So, so
Yeah.
behind all that is what are we using an addictive behavior for? In other
Yeah.
words, are we using it to cope with the stress or cope with something that's upsetting us and all that sort of thing?
Yeah. I totally agree with that. So there's loads of evidence, obviously, that kids who had adverse life experiences when they were younger, much more likely to fall into that addiction trap, whether that's with food or other things. um a lot of we tend to see more females in treatment, but a lot of those females had fathers, proportion I should say, have report having fathers who had alcohol problems. So A, that's a bit traumatic, isn't it? But B, there's probably a genetic component there. We do think there's a genetic component, and definitely adult adverse experiences, trauma, can, trigger a more severe episode. So I had somebody who'd had a really horrible experience. Someone had come into her house, and anyway, we won't go into the details. But yeah, it was a sort of out of the blue, very traumatic incident, and that was the initial trigger for her really having these terrible problems with, yeah, just blotting things out with food, because sugar really is a drug. It does have that effect in the brain. And yeah, if you eat enough, you can be sort of what would be the word, just sort of, yeah, blot things out, as you said, really, in a similar way to alcohol. Before we go on, I should say that of the criteria that I talked about, the six, the World Health Organization would consider you to have a, a problem or a possible sort of addictive problem if you have three or more symptoms. So you don't have to have all those symptoms to meet the criteria. You have to have three or more. I mean, I would have been six back in the day, but and a lot of people that come for treatment would screen as six, but three or more indicates that there's something, something to look at there, probably.
I remember reading that seminal book, Molecules of Emotion, where the author said that sugar was as addictive. Well, I'm not sure he said as addictive as heroin, but hitting the same pathway. So, what
Yeah.
is going on in the brain? What are the manufacturers trying to light up so that we eat more of their products? What's going on in the chemistry of the brain?
Yeah. So the dopamine dopamine neurotransmitter is the sort of major reward and motivation neurotransmitter in the reward center of the brain. And obviously, when we eat, we get a bit of dopamine because it's rewarding, and it's used for all kinds of, motivating other behaviors and getting a reward and so on. But what happens with drugs, and in the case that we're discussing, sugar and ultra processed food, you get an unnaturally high sort of release of dopamine. So any substance that travels fast to the brain and is in a sort of concentrated form, so nicotine, drugs you mentioned, with the lab animals, they're often doing experiments on comparing cocaine and sugar water and this kind of thing. Nick Olivina's work. Yeah, so what we get when we have our big dose of sugar, refined carbohydrates, ultra processed food, is we get this sort of unnaturally big dopamine boost. And like everything in nature, the brain is trying to maintain some kind of homeostasis to keep some kind of balance between things. So um because there's all this dopamine sloshing around temporarily, it what it does is down some dopamine receptors are downgraded, because we know that these neurotransmitters sort of pass messages by being passing messages between the neurons. So some receptors are sort of downgraded over time, and the more and more we repeat that behavior, the fewer dopamine receptors we're going to have. And so the result is a lesser availability of dopamine over time. And this is what explains the tolerance effect. So the reason that we need more and more of whatever it is to get the same effect over time is because the brain's doing that. It's down regulating some receptors. So we need more and more to get the same effect. And also, it's we can really understand that it's a bad idea to downregulate our dopamine receptors, because dopamine is the neurotransmitter of reward and motivation. And so it's also the explanation why we start getting less interested in other rewards in life, like we were saying, family, work, hobbies, activities, and so on. Because those suddenly seem kind of less exciting than this one thing that we've got fixated on for trying to, we're sort of trying to boost our dopamine, but the long term result is a downward spiral to less dopamine. And we know for sure that high sugar diets are linked with depression and other mental health problems. And this is probably the main explanation in that we're sort of robbing ourselves of our natural levels of available dopamine because we've shut down the receptors. So that's one thing that's going on. And there's a similar sort of process with serotonin, which is the sort of relaxed, happy hormone, happy neurotransmitter. Um, there's a similar process to that where, we can get at least initially this high boost of serotonin, but then the down regulating of the neurotransmitter. And of course, serotonin is the neurotransmitter that's allegedly implicated in depression. So again, not a great idea to be doing that to the brain, really.
It sounds a bit like the louder you listen to music, the deafer you get, until eventually you can't even hear the birds singing.
Yeah, exactly. Because yeah, but it makes sense when you think about it, doesn't it? That
Yeah.
if there's that loud messaging, then there's a response in the brain and the body, which is, well, we're not listening, we're not listening to that anymore because it's sort of out of balance, really.
And presumably that, I mean, I want to ask you how we break free. And of course, the simple answer is just don't eat the stuff. But then you get the withdrawal effects. And as you said, there's a period of up to 2 weeks. And presumably that's when these dopamine receptors, hopefully down-regulated is the official term, up-regulate and start to come back to life. But yeah, what's the key to breaking free?
Yeah, it's painful in the meantime. I mean, it is true that of course, if we're understanding this model of sugar ultra processed food addiction as an addiction, then we completely understand what the treatment for addiction is: alcohol addiction, drug addiction, and it's abstinence from that substance so that the brain can heal and recover and sort of restore its natural balance and signaling. So yeah, then it's a question of, well, how do you do that? Because people often have really tried to do that on their own. So I think it's important to um a number of things, really. One is, particularly if you're on any medication for diabetes or blood pressure, whatever it may be, not to sort of embark on this journey by just going cold turkey without talking to someone about it, really. So if you're on any of those sorts of medication, just like if you were going low carb or keto to help your metabolic health, it's all the same, really. You would be careful if you're on medication because we don't want any untoward incidences for people. I think the other thing is to really, you know, get get the help that you need. Consult somebody who knows what they're doing, to get involved with a group of people, because we know that, again, addiction treatment's so much more successful if people work in groups. They're supporting each other. They've got other people to talk about the challenges to, who understand it, because often we're in families where other people aren't food addicts, so they don't need to abstain. You don't need to abstain completely if you're that strange unicorn that can actually moderate and have one biscuit and move on with your day, or one sip of whiskey, or whiskey on your birthday and move on with your day. um you don't need to go that far. But if it's really addiction we're talking about, it's really good to be in touch with someone who can support you properly and knows what they're doing, and also understand that it is a lifelong journey. It's in essence simple, as you said, but it's difficult to maintain long term, and people are bound to slip up at times and need support to sort of get back on track. Um, so some people go, I was a cold turkey person. It kind of suits my personality, just cut it out and go through the 8 days of feeling like you've got the flu. But then feeling amazing. Well, for me, it was day 8, so feeling amazing day 8, like the lights have come on. Other people try and take a more stepwise approach, and that can work. It can work to sort of, maybe a harm reduction model where what you're doing is, what are the worst offenders. So say for Heidi, let's say we're talking about Heidi and hers was the Maltesers. I mean, the first thing would be to ban those. um, and to sort of keep moving through. I've had other people with Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Coke, that kind of stuff, sweet drinks where they've sort of increasingly diluted those things till they become much less palatable and much less sort of, so they've gone in a more stepwise way. So you can do that, but I would say for a lot of us that are sort of hardcore food addicts, it is quite hard to do the stepwise thing because you can always find a sneaky way of um you know humans find black and white a little bit more easy to follow, don't they, than grey areas, because if you're an addict, you're always trying to sort of play the grey areas and sort of justify certain things that probably shouldn't be justified.
Well,
So
I found that there's a little triggers. Oh, that's delicious. And
mm,
nearly every time I hear that, I look at what it is that's delicious.
yes, and some
And
some buggers put sugar in it. Like, so we're always moaning when we go around Marks and Spencers. I hope they're listening. Marks and Spencers, why do you put sugar in your coleslaw? Why?
yeah, I mean, no, I had this where, yeah, a friend of mine said, "Oh, the Balazoo balsamic vinegar is the best." And I looked at it, it was I think 80,
Full of
80% sugar.
full
And
of
then someone
sugar.
else
Yeah,
said,
balsamic
I,
vinegar is full
I
of sugar.
love their white vinegar, and it's 50% sugar. Now, you don't need to have vinegar full of sugar. But what I've been doing recently, and also helping people who are sort of quitting alcohol, is we've been trying out these sencha drinks. It's called GABA spirits, together with some fizzy mineral water, ice, and so on. And I make a very nice drink in the evening where I use sparkling water, a little shot of ginger, and a little bit of Angostura bitters, which of course
Yeah.
is alcohol. And it's sort of, I mean, many years ago, I helped develop a drink called Aqua Libra, which was the first sort of
I
posh
remember.
drink that you
Yeah.
could take to a party and not feel like a twat and drink. So things that just have a little feeling. Now, I wanted to ask about food combinations because rather than just focusing on what not to have, what are the sort of, instead eat this, or whether there are certain combos that are much better for you and combos that are bad for you. I've heard that sugar and fat, messes up the control signals in the brain. Sugar and protein will release the sugars more slowly and so on. So, yeah, what about food combos?
Yeah, so I mean, really, the advice is to stick to whole, real foods as nature intended. So the kinds of things that I'm sure you talk about all the time, which is obviously fish, eggs, meat, vegetables, low carb vegetables, and so on. There's a bit of variability between people, how in a way how strict they have to go. It's individual, obviously, like always, isn't it? Whether people can cope with certain things. Now we do find that dairy can be pretty problematic for food addicts, partly because it's got that lovely texture, and also it's salty and fatty, and there is that little bit of carbs in the, say, double cream. I've had lots of people come on our residential weekends who, their issue actually is dairy. They knew they've been food addicts for a long time, but they're trying to now quit the dairy, which can be quite the challenge. So not everybody has to quit the dairy, but for some people, the behaviors around dairy become the same. And as our good friend Ken Berry in the States says, well, what other adult mammal eats? Basically, milk is a sort of baby food. It's a baby food for baby cows or baby other mammals. We're the only adults that try and eat dairy. So I always try and keep that in mind.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's programmed to make caseomorphines because
Yeah.
the most important thing for a young animal of any sort is to get addicted to the breast. That's a
Mm.
critical survival
It's just
technique.
another survival
Yeah.
issue.
So,
Um,
so those
yes,
opioids,
there's
are
that as well.
literally getting you. I was addicted to cheese when I was young.
Mm.
It created all sorts of problems, but I just loved. In fact, I think I asked Father Christmas if I could be a cheesecake taster as my career.
Oh,
And
bless.
many years later,
Cheese
well,
and
actually,
sugar.
strangely enough, on I think it was GMTV, they had a show where they'd have two of the best chefs, and then two members of the public would In this case, it was who makes the best cheesecake. So they had two of the top chefs. They had two, people who said their cheesecake was the best, and they actually employed me. They paid me to taste cheesecake, which I did. But by then, I'd become allergic to it. Within an hour, I had an absolute splitting migraine, and
Oh, interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and,
Yes, that's right. And
and
it's a common migraine trigger, isn't it? Or terrible constipation. So that's another thing that can happen to people is that because of the casomorphins, they
oh,
start to get terrible gut trouble.
and I remember the work of that lovely man, the Dubliner Paul Kenny at Mount Sinai, and he fed rats either lots of sugar and they became overweight, but they sort of controlled their limits somewhat, or lots of fat. Same thing happened, but the combo, well, there's a nice picture of a rat diving into a cheesecake, actually, but it's the combo of sugar and fat that seemed
Yeah.
to, they just didn't stop eating. But I always suspected that it wasn't just sugar and fat, but it was also sugar and fat and milk. And of course, what is about the milk chocolate? I mean, we know there's dark chocolate, but there's something about milk chocolate for people that is so much more addictive. So much confectionery is based on sugar, fat, and milk.
Yes, and that's that texture, that sort of mouth feel that they all try and recreate with these terrible soy lecithins and so on that wreck your guts. But yeah, that sort of easy texture, I think, is another the whole texture factor is another thing. But yeah, carbs, sugar, and fat is probably the holy addictive trinity. So pizza, donuts, they've done research when they've said, what is it people binge on or what is it that people crave, and it's those kinds of things. The other thing that people can get into trouble with and may need to sort of put on the blacklist if they're a food addict is nuts, and particularly if they're salted and roasted. So that's the same issue again. It's because there aren't many times in nature where you get fat, salt, and carbs all together. Um, so so nuts is another thing that, although it's a real food, sometimes food addicts have to be a bit careful with those. It's a bit stimulating, if you like. So yeah, I mean, obviously, it's important that people still really enjoy their meals. They're eating, nutrient dense food, because this is another mechanism where the modern diet just starves us of the essential macronutrients, basically,
Mm.
and micronutrients, so that, is there a mechanism whereby we keep eating, or our brains are trying to keep us eating until we've had enough of whatever macro and micronutrient it is we're deprived of. We see all the time, particularly women, not eating enough protein, um, that the amounts that they would need, because we've all been sort of told, to eat, these low fat foods with lots of grains and complex carbohydrates, but that crowds out the nutrient dense food like the seafood, or I've just had some homemade chicken liver pate for my lunch. Highly nutrient dense with lots of micronutrients and vitamins and minerals in.
Well, I remember when I used to work with bulimics, I would say, "What do you binge on?" And not always, but nearly always, they binged on things that were made of wheat, sugar, or milk.
Yes.
And the wheat may be carbs. We don't know it's necessarily a gluten thing, but I would say you can eat whatever you like, whenever you like, no restrictions, but do not eat wheat and milk
Mm.
or sugar. And, it was very often, a sort of key point that there are trigger foods. And it's funny because in the world of sort of allergy and food intolerance, a telltale sign is it's the food that you love.
Yes.
I mean, I actually adore a whiskey and some peanuts, but I react to it.
Mm.
Not
Yeah.
to other nuts, but peanuts. I actually react to that. So it's funny how the thing you love often becomes the
Yes.
thing that you're hypersensitive to.
Hypersensitive, and again, that thing, it's doing you harm, but if you find yourself going back to it, if you were eating peanuts every night and then feeling terrible, would say, well, that's a bit of a that's a problem, really. You need to, think about cutting those out. But yeah, it's difficult for people because they crave them and they don't want to cut them out.
Yeah, one of the things that saddens me when I wrote the book, How to Quit Without Feeling Shit, and I should explain here that what happened was a professor of addiction studies, David Miller, and a doctor, Dr. James Brawley,
Mm.
came to me with two suitcases full of research and said, "We want you to write the book, which was How to Quit Without Feeling S star star T." And the critical new finding, and I remember Joan Carson, who was running a treatment center, she said, if you've scrambled your brain, sitting around in a group and talking about it won't unscramble your brains. Someone else said, whatever it is that led you into addiction, once you've got, this biochemical, physiological, biological addiction,
Yeah.
solving that when maybe you became an alcoholic because your relationship was crap, but once you are an alcoholic, just solving your relationship doesn't stop the
Doesn't
craving.
stop the addiction.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It has to be sort of abstinence first, and then we always say to people you'll kind of see what's left, because they often come and they say, I think I need therapy for this or whatever. We were talking about difficult situations or trauma or things that have got people into it. And we'd say, well, just let's deal with it. Let's get clean in a sense, and we'll see what happens to the brain, see how it sort of reacts to that. And you often find that actually at the end of it, people say, oh, well, I seem to have, that seems to be fine now. I feel so much better, and the brain's sort of settled down, and you
The
know,
essence, the essence of this book, certainly with a lot of addicts, was that some for many months and some for many years don't fully recover. And the issue is, how do you unscramble your brains? And I'll give you an example. So, Joanna Moncrief has done wonderful work in her new book, Chemically Imbalanced,
mm,
pointing out that overall, you cannot really substantiate the view that depression is caused by low serotonin overall. I
mhm,
have to say, in our Brain Bio Center clinic, we used to measure what I think is the only accurate measure of serotonin, platelet serotonin. It's very hard. Some people are really low in serotonin,
mm,
and the precursor for serotonin is a form of tryptophan, 5-HTP, and it worked really well, and
yeah,
lots of clinical trials. So when I read her book, what she does say in the end is that being on antidepressants, and we're talking, it's a bit like eating lots of sugar, ultimately does depress serotonin, but just go cold turkey. And in my experience with people coming off antidepressants, giving 5-HTP, zinc, vitamin C, omega-3, etc., makes a phenomenal difference to the withdrawal process. So
yeah,
it makes me wonder here, dopamine, from which we make adrenaline and noradrenaline, is actually made, like everything in our body, directly from tyrosine,
yeah,
which is an amino acid. The making of dopamine, which now we think is down-regulated, so we're desperate for dopamine, depends on methylation, which is B vitamins and so on. So, yeah, what slightly saddens me in all these conversations is just not realizing that a scrambled, addicted brain needs to recover, and the process could be speeded up. And the consequence of that is those withdrawal symptoms,
yeah,
those abstinence symptoms would go away. And
yeah.
that's a good thing.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that's a great point. And I think, this, yeah, there's the world of food addiction is in its absolute infancy in terms of treatment. And it would be great to see, see some trials on that. I'd be super interested in that. And then of course we've got the whole GLP-1
Yeah.
thrown in for good measure, and we don't quite know how that's gonna um, roll out.
Yeah, I would like to ask you about that. But just before that, I was giving a lecture actually, and I asked people if anyone had taken, it was about weight loss and whether they'd, I think, taken chromium as well as my low GL diet, which is very much what you're talking about. And
Mm,
one person stood up and said, I've lost 9 stone, and someone else said, I lost 5 stone, or whatever it is. And somebody else stood up and said, I've lost nothing, but I
mm,
didn't do it to lose weight. I did it because I'm a sugar addict. And in
mm,
this case, the mineral chromium very
mhm.
specifically cut their sugar craving, quite dramatically. We know that chromium in high dose, like 600 micrograms, very effective for diabetics. So yeah, there's a territory there. So
Yeah.
you mentioned, the government want a quick fix. So the NHS are proposing we all just take a GLP-1 agonist like Ozempic or Wegovy. What is your reaction to this?
Yes, many pros, many cons. I think the cons are, that if people are already eating a nutrient depleted diet, ultra processed food, high ultra processed food diet, by giving them an injection, they're just going to eat less of a poor diet. So that's number one problem, isn't it? People are going to become even more nutrient depleted and even more protein deficient, etc., etc. So I think that's a worry. We don't know obviously the long term effects of people having these drugs, and we know that there are significant risks. I think there's an article a while ago, 82 people in the UK had died of associated GLP-1 associated factors. There's a number of risks. So, but on the pro side, so obviously I can't prescribe them, but I know that David's when he's had been working with people that have got severe food addiction problems, and they just don't seem to be able, they just can't follow the advice basically. And they're maybe waiting for surgery. I had one chap waiting for surgery who just, couldn't get his head round, being abstinent from those things. So he would start on a sort of minimum dose of GLP-1s and to help them not have that strength of food noise, although the strength of cravings, that then they can start to improve their diet and follow the advice that we've been talking about, and yeah, and lose a significant amount of weight, but use the opportunity of being on the GLP-1s to follow the advice and to get to a good point. So I think the problem is where these GLP-1s are just being prescribed on the internet through pharmacies without any counseling, nutrition, follow up, anything like that. I think they probably have got a place for people who are, really struggling.
And the,
Uh,
the logic there would be, maybe you do it for 3 months and you kind of clean up your act. One,
exactly.
one
Yeah.
of the things
Well,
I
a bit
really,
like methadone or something,
yeah.
it's a sort of interim effect, and nobody would be put on methadone without being part of a drug support service, that kind of thing. So it would be a similar sort of model, I think.
And one of the big problems I see is the loss of muscle mass that these drugs
Yeah,
promote. And
and that, yes, of course, that's so important, particularly because a lot of certainly a lot of the people that we see are sort of middle-aged to older women. It's really a disaster if they start losing muscle mass and bone mass.
well, yeah, I mean the average person over 50 is losing half a pound of muscle a year. And the point is muscle is really metabolically active. If you
Yeah.
like, it soaks up and uses some of that excess sugar and carbs if it can. And I think particularly in women, it's the old thing. I carry my wife's suitcase and open the door and all that sort of thing.
Mm.
And the loss of upper body muscle, not only in women, but more in women than men, is a major factor. It amazes me when I go to London and I'm going up and down the escalators and the tube and all the rest of it.
Mm.
Virtually nobody walks. I see a set of stairs or an escalator and I think, great, it's like I'm in the gym. Now's my
Talk
chance.
up it. Yeah, we race up it and see who can win.
Exactly. So that loss of muscle is a factor because then you don't have that metabolically active, material to sort of
Mm.
buffer.
Yeah. It's that whole ancestral thing again, isn't it? That we're adapted for an environment that no longer exists, a environment that no longer exists, and a physical and working environment that no longer exists. Yeah, we're all inactive. We all eat rubbish all day long, watch television, and I mean, it is scary, really. Um, yeah, Dave and I we're talking at an ancestral health event in a couple of weeks up here in the north, and we've been thinking about all this, and we're saying really, probably it is mankind that's going to lose out and nature that's going to win because we're we're just we're really on the going to hell in a handcart. And if you look at, even like Chernobyl or something, like nature comes back, nature will survive, but it's us lot that's going to make ourselves extinct at this rate.
Yeah, I wonder whether it's alcohol or sugar that is the opiate of the masses.
Mm.
Do you think food addiction is not only driving the diabetes epidemic, but also dementia?
I mean, yes, I'm sure you'd agree. But yes, we know it's really harming the brain, and a lot of people that come to us sort of, they have this terrible brain fog. They're developing cognitive problems. In fact, this is Heidi's story. So my story is very much typical food addict, kind of getting overweight and always trying to diet and all of this and sort of the sort of typical presentation. But hers, she'd never been overweight, and about 15% of food addicts are not overweight, or they may be underweight. And she had this very high flying career, um, and had always been slim and had always loved sugar and cakes, and um, had always been told, "Oh, you're so lucky, you can eat whatever you like." So she did basically, didn't think about nutrition at all, and she was only in her, I think she was kind of in her late 30s, early 40s, and started getting to the middle of a meeting that she was leading and just losing her place, not knowing what was going on, having some pretty serious cognitive problems. And long story short, anyway, in the long run, she started working on herself with nutrition, thinking, this probably a factor, that I'm eating all this sugar all the time. And you've probably met Heidi. She's absolutely sharp as a tack now. um, and brain veritably humming. But she had a few years there where everyone was very, very concerned about her family and so on. And yeah, she's managed to sort of reverse that and train nutritionists and doing all this work in the space because she feels so passionate about it. So, food addiction doesn't always look like just like a typical diabetes problem. It can look like cognitive difficulties and mental health problems as well.
And then you get in this vicious cycle that, for example, if you are feeling tired all the time, possibly overweight, you don't want to exercise. And then if your brain is foggy, your motivation to learn new things
Yeah,
goes. You have less brain stimulation, less body stimulation.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, my advice would be if you're, craving something sweet, first, go for a walk. I used to say always, well, I do really, that never eat a carbohydrate without protein. So even
Mm,
if you are going to have an apple, have some nuts or seeds
mm,
or half an apple. And
yeah,
that seems to help. And also, don't end the meal with a dessert. Break out of that habit. Go for, have your main course starter, whatever. Go for a walk.
yeah.
If you're using food, to deal with the stress at the end of the day, maybe use exercise instead. Now, you've mentioned Heidi, and you've mentioned the campaign to get food addiction actually classified as a disease. And I
Yeah.
believe this is the work through the Collaborative Health Community, CHC. Tell us a little bit about that. And I think there's a conference coming up.
Yes, it's all very exciting. So Heidi is the one who's initially set up this charity called the CHC that you've mentioned. And there's two projects within that. One is us, and we're Food Addiction Solutions, and I'll tell you all the things we're doing. The other one is Collaboration for Kids, which is focusing on helping children and families make better choices around food. It's a sort of preventative campaign, if you like, because obviously we're trying to pull people out of the river, and help them to sort of change their behavior. But wouldn't it be so much better if the kids and the families didn't get into these difficulties in the first place? So that's Collaboration for Kids. We're Food Addiction Solutions, and we've really our mission is to get food addiction recognized in the same way as alcohol, all those things, the other things we've been talking about, um, and also to do research around this topic, and also to educate healthcare professionals so that when somebody goes to a healthcare professional, that person has some idea about how to recognize food addiction and how to have a sort of sensible conversation about what that person might do, because if you're 7 times more likely to have diabetes, for example, if you've got a food addiction problem. So just about every healthcare professional in the UK is coming across people with food addiction in every clinic. And I can guarantee you that less than 1% of those healthcare professionals would know how to screen or what to do about it. So that's what we're sort of set up to do. So I've been co-editing a special issue of Frontiers in Psychiatry. That's another thing we've been up to, and we've made this submission to the WHO. That's gone in again recently to get the condition recognised. And every year we're planning to have an international food addiction conference. So we did that for the first time last year in London at the Royal College of GPs. So we're doing it in London again this year, the Royal College of GPs, 2 days this time, 4th and 5th of September. The first day is very much about the latest on food addiction research and practice. And the second day is food addiction and its comorbidities. So cancer, cardiology, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and mental health
And is it
problems.
only for health practitioners or can the public attend?
Oh, definitely the public can come. We had quite a few public last year who were, obviously if this is maybe your issue and you're interested in learning more or you're just interested in the topic, it would be entirely suitable for the public. And as I've said, highly suitable for any healthcare professionals, GPs, practice nurses, dietitians, anybody like that. Yeah.
And I know if you're a friend of Food for the Brain, you can use a code FFB and get an amazing discount. Uh,
Mm,
and you don't have to go live, but it's very nice and social. You can also attend it virtually.
yes.
And the
I
web,
think it's
and the
40,
web,
I think it's 40% off if,
yeah.
if you use the code.
Oh, it's a fabulous lineup. And go to chc.org and you'll very quickly find that and information on all these other brilliant campaigns. And I guess really, what can we do other than spreading the word to help get food addiction actually recognized as a real condition that needs help?
Yeah, I mean, support us. Yes, come to the conference. You can actually go into the ICD platform and support our submission and comment on it. You have to sign up to the platform to do it. So probably the best thing for that is to maybe actually get in touch with me or Heidi at the charity. Email us through the-chc.org. And we would sort of help you do that if you want to support us sort of practically like that. We also have a donation button, obviously, so anyone who really believes in this cause and wants to donate. And the other thing is, we're all
Everything you didn't spend on Maltesers.
exactly whatever you're saving on Maltesers, please donate. Um, we're all volunteers. I'm actually supposed to be retired, probably like you, Patrick. So, um, if anybody has any expertise that they think they could bring, whether that's sort of website expertise or project management or admin or whatever you think, and if you wanted to sort of discuss joining our team and joining the campaign, we that's how we roll. That's how everybody on the team's got involved so far. So we'd love to hear from anyone.
And you're also doing a talk for foodforthebrain.org on the 16th of September, I believe. So a live webinar for those who want to get really into this subject.
Yes, that'll be great. Yes, we shall be doing a webinar.
So if you're on the list for foodforthebrain.org, you will learn about that. And you have a book. Tell us about your book.
Oh, my little lockdown project was to write a small book. Really, it's aimed at the general public, but also healthcare professionals who want to learn those basics could read it as well. It's called Fork in the Road. Um, and it's available on Amazon. So it's Jen Unwin, Fork in the Road on Amazon, and it's just really summarizing the kinds of things we've talked about, like how to recognize if it's a problem, what kind of foods to eat, how to navigate sort of the difficult social situations that people get in, how to get more support if you feel you need it. And we've got a journal that goes alongside it to help people embed the changes as like a 100-day journal, which you'd also find if you just put Fork in the Road in Amazon. Um, yeah,
Well, Jen, thank you so much for all your fantastic work across so many different platforms, teaching us how to eat to live rather than live to eat. I think that would be a good byline there.
that is definitely the byline.
Yeah, so keep up the good work, and thank you so much for being a guest on my podcast.
Thank you so much.